When I was in 10th grade, my English teacher taught our class about the hero's journey. It's this storyline which you see over and over and over in these stories of heroes. And we see it in movies and TV shows. In fact, George Lucas used it as the model that he wrote the script for Star Wars off of for Luke Skywalker. And you see it all over the place, even back to mythology thousands of years ago. It's a very interesting storyline, and people have studied it in depth, including my 10th grade English class. And it's based on some of these works of scholars. In 1949, Joseph Campbell published this book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And later in 1998, David Leeming published a book, The Voyage of the Hero. And each of these scholars summarizes it a little differently. But in essence, the hero's journey starts with perhaps an obscure origin, that people don't know exactly where the hero comes from. But then they are called into this adventure, and they go in this quest that they are unsure of how they will even get to the other end of. And so they face trials and they face challenges, and through the process, they are transformed. And in this transformation process, they become this example that others look to and admire, and they become heroic. And in the end, they arrive at a place, a resting place once again, that is perhaps better than the place they started from. And to me, if you ask me, this sounds quite a lot like our journey as a Christian. And perhaps the greatest stories on earth are variations of the one true great story which God is writing. So I can't walk through the entire hero's journey today in one sermonette, but today I would like to focus on the first element of the hero's journey, which is the calling and our response to it. And I think that this is an important thing to think about as we approach the Pentecost. In essence, we might think of our calling as our own calling to our personal salvation. But what it means to be part of the first fruits and in the first resurrection, it's something more than our personal salvation. It means something more, that God wants to use us as an example, as lights that others look to. And when we respond to a calling right now, we are allowing God to lead us on this trying journey that's difficult and may be hard at times, but it has the worthwhile fruits in the end. The heroic journey, like I mentioned, it starts in obscurity. Our Christian walk, not many wise men are called. And then this is the way David Leeming describes this, the beginnings. He describes it this way, that in the hero's journey, the child is suddenly aware of forces infinitely larger than himself, which he cannot fully comprehend. To get through this stage, the child often requires outside assistance. The intervention of a powerful being often becomes a divine sign. And so our calling begins with an awareness that there is something bigger than ourselves out there, something so vast that we cannot comprehend. And it sometimes begins with a small sign, something like a burning bush. Many years ago, thousands of years ago, a hero of sorts approached a mountain. This was a familiar mountain to him. He had been there many years, what seemed like a long time ago, but maybe it was only a matter of months. But he approached this mountain, which he used to wander around with flocks of sheep. And now on this occasion, he was with a different sort of flock. He was with the flock of Israel, a very large flock of his own brethren. And this was a significant moment to Moses, because in this moment, as he approached Mount Sinai, he may have remembered the words that God spoke to him. In Exodus 3, verse 12, God told him, "I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." So God told him he would arrive back at the same place that he was called from. And how did this calling happen? Well, to him it was just another day in the life of a shepherd. just ordinary day-to-day life, walking around with the sheep, going and gathering the stray. And it would have seemed like any other day, except for that particular day, Moses saw a strange sight. There was a bush in the distance that seemed to be on fire. And as he stared intently at it, he saw not only is it on fire, it doesn't seem to stop being on fire. It doesn't burn up. And so he went over to investigate this strange sight. And apparently this is what the great I Am wanted, because as soon as Moses approached, God called to him from the bush, and he gave Moses a calling that was very personally difficult for him. And he pushed back as much as he possibly could against it, because what it meant for him, in this moment, he might have thought about the circumstances from which he left Egypt in the first place. See, God was calling him not just to go back to Egypt in circumstances without any backstory. No, Moses had a backstory. He left Egypt after hearing words that perhaps changed his life forever, and words he might have remembered in this moment. That one day in Egypt, he saw a couple of his fellow Israelites fighting among themselves, and he asked them, "Why are you fighting? Aren't you brethren?" And one of the Israelites turned and said to Moses, "Who made you prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And in those words, Moses saw not only was this thing known, he in previous weeks had killed an Egyptian taskmaster out of his zeal and love for his people, but now he saw that something that was theoretically successfully brushed under the rug is now so widely known that a random pair of Israelites talking to each other knew of this incident. And so he knew that his life was in danger because the Egyptians would see him as a traitor. And not only that, his very own brethren questioned him and saying, "Who made you a judge and a prince before us?" And so in that very moment, he saw he had no future in Egypt. Nothing. No one wanted him. And so he left. And this is perhaps what he thought of when God called him to go back to Egypt. And God thought it worth mentioning, "Moses, the people that sought your life are no longer alive." God had to reassure him of this before he went back. These are the things that troubled Moses all these 40 years of his life as a shepherd. And perhaps he had this sense of he had run away from something. And maybe he thought he could live an entire life as a shepherd and never confront the problems of his past. But maybe there was this nagging feeling inside of him that he couldn't just walk away from this. See, Moses didn't live an ordinary life. He was called away from his brethren in unordinary circumstances. He was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised among Egyptian royalty, the elite of class of one of the greatest nations on earth. He knew how they thought and how they operated. He perhaps talked with the great merchants and the great military commanders. And in fact, Josephus even writes that Moses led a successful campaign against the Ethiopians. So he himself may have had some status among the Egyptian elite. This is what Moses came from. And so how could Moses remain as a shepherd forever? And this is perhaps what he had to confront in that moment at the burning bush, that he was called for something more. And how did he get into this position in the first place? His mother put him in a basket, and Pharaoh's daughter had compassion when she saw Moses in a basket floating on the water and adopted him as her own. And so Moses, his name means drawn from water. And this would be the symbol for his life. And not only his life, he may have seen this beautiful allegory in the way that Moses left Egypt as one being drawn from water to an entire nation being drawn from a Red Sea. And so in essence, an entire nation became a Moses of sorts, drawn from water. And here he was on this eve of Pentecost and confronting an even greater sign still. Turn with me now over to Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19. This is a description of, we're not told that this is specifically Pentecost, but it's Jewish tradition that God gave the law at Mount Sinai on Pentecost Day. In verse 16 of Exodus 19, we read, "In the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of trumpet was very loud, so that all the people were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood before the mountain. And Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And so Moses went from a bush that was on fire as one person to a nation drawn from water to a mountain on fire. And so Israel was following the same path. God wrote the story of Moses, and God wrote the story of Israel. And these people were following the path of Moses, and just like Moses, they were to be given a calling, which we read in a few verses up in Exodus 19 and verse 5. "Now, therefore, if you indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." So Moses' story and his life went beyond just his life. His calling was not just for his own calling, but his calling was so that he might lead a great nation to the place where God would call them. And his story is summarized in perhaps what we could call a hall of the heroes of faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 23, I'll read this synopsis here of Moses' life. "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, he looked to the reward. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he be destroyed, the firstborn should touch them. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned." And so you can see the story of Moses ends with the leaving the Red Sea. This is the story of Moses being drawn from water. But we all know that the story of Moses didn't end in the final destination. Moses saw it from afar off. In the end, Moses failed as the leader who would bring the people to the promised land, and God took him to a mountain top and showed him the promised land from a distance. Rather, it was Joshua, or Yeshua, as he would be called in the Hebrew, who led them into the promised land. And we also know that Israel, who was to be the model nation that would bring the other nations to God as the example nation, they too failed. And they failed to lead the nations of the world to a promised land, in essence. And so they too failed. And so we see the need for a greater heroic story. And in the end, another one who is named Yeshua, or Jesus as we know him, led a greater heroic journey, the greatest of heroic journeys, which we'll hear of more tomorrow. And I'll close here with the comparison of the two great mountains. So we looked at Moses' life, and we saw that he made it into this heroic hall of fame, these heroes of faith in Hebrews 11. And then in the very next chapter, we see in chapter 12 and verse 18, "For you have not come to the mountain that may not be touched and burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness of a tempest, and the sound of trumpet, and the voice of words, so that those who begged it and heard it begged, and that the word should not be spoken to them anymore." And a little bit further in 22, "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect. It is to this mountain we approach tomorrow at the Pentecost, and this mountain that we will be called as part of the firstborn of the first fruits that will be a model nation to all other nations. It is the story of this hero's journey that if we allow God to lead us on, we will follow the same path that Moses followed, the same path that Jesus Christ followed to perfection, leading Israel to the final destination, which is to come. So we might not be heroes of a nation like Moses was, but this is our chance in this lifetime that in small ways we can be heroic to our family or to our friends, to our communities, to our coworkers, and they may look to us and say, wow, they do good things. And we can remember the words of Matthew 5:16, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." And so if we allow God to dwell within us, we in essence become like this burning bush, this light to the world that they can see and glorify the God in heaven who writes our story and makes us into this heroic and beautiful and brilliant thing. And they will recognize that if they join with us and they join with our Father in heaven, they too will be part of a story that is worth telling and a life worth living. And they will be part of the great story in which God heroically rescues his family from a spiritual Egypt.